The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain of Cedar Valley, where the Snake River carved its ancient path through the wilderness. Cowman, a weathered rancher in his mid-40s, stood on the porch of his isolated cabin, nursing his third cup of black coffee. His steel-gray eyes, hardened by years of solitude and loss, scanned the horizon with the practiced vigilance of a man who had learned to trust no one but himself. The silence of the valley was broken by something that made Cowman's blood run cold, the desperate, heart-wrenching cries of a child echoing from the direction of the river. In a town where folks minded their own business and trouble was best left alone, most would have turned away, closed their doors, and pretended they heard nothing. But something in that cry, pure terror mixed with unbearable grief, stirred something deep within Cowman's chest that he thought had died years ago. Setting down his coffee with deliberate care, Cowman reached for his worn leather holster and strapped it around his waist. The weight of his Colt .45 felt familiar against his hip as he mounted his black stallion Thunder and rode hard toward the source of the anguished wails. The river bend came into view, and what Cowman saw there would haunt him for the rest of his days. A boy, no more than 10 years old, knelt beside a man lying motionless on the rocky shore. Blood seeped into the earth beneath the fallen figure, and the child's small hands were stained crimson as he desperately tried to wake his father. "Please, Papa, please wake up," the boy sobbed, his voice breaking with each word. Cowman dismounted quickly, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. The man on the ground was still breathing, but barely. A bullet wound in his chest told the story of violence, and his pale complexion spoke of a man fighting his final battle. "Son," Cowman said gently, kneeling beside the boy, "what happened here?" The child looked up with tear-filled eyes, his face streaked with dirt and despair. I went to see the waterfall upstream. Papa said to stay close, but I wanted to see it so bad. When I came back, there were men on horses riding away fast. They hurt my papa." Cowman's jaw tightened as he examined the wound. This was no random act of violence. The shot was precise, calculated. "Did you see these men? Could you tell me anything about them?" "They were too far away," the boy whispered. "But I heard one of them shout something about sending a message before they rode off toward town." The dying man's eyes fluttered open, focusing with great effort on Cowman's face. With tremendous will, he grabbed Cowman's shirt and pulled him closer. His voice was barely a whisper, but his words carried the weight of a dying man's truth. "My name is Thomas Hartwell," he gasped. This wasn't a robbery. They wanted my land, the railroad, Blackwood. He sent them." Cowman's eyes widened. Cornelius Blackwood was the wealthiest man in Cedar Valley, a railroad baron whose influence reached into every corner of the territory. But why would he want this particular piece of land badly enough to kill for it? "My boy, Samuel," Thomas continued, his grip weakening. "He's in danger now. Blackwood, he'll come for him. The land, it's worth more than he offered. There's something beneath it. Promise me. Protect my son." With his final breath, Thomas Hartwell pressed a folded piece of paper into Cowman's hand. The man who had lived as a hermit for the past 5 years suddenly found himself responsible for a grieving child and a secret that powerful men were willing to kill to protect. As Samuel clung to his father's lifeless body, Cowman made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He couldn't take the boy back to town, not if Blackwood's men were involved. His cabin would have to become their sanctuary, at least until he could figure out what Thomas Hartwell had discovered that was worth dying for. "Samuel," Cowman said softly, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your father was a brave man, and he loved you very much. But right now, we need to get you somewhere safe." The boy looked up at this stranger with eyes that had aged years in a single morning. "Are you going to help me find the men who killed my papa?" Cowman studied the child's face, seeing a determination that reminded him of himself at that age. "Yes, son, I promise you that. But first, we need to make sure you're safe. Can you be brave for me?" Samuel nodded, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. As they prepared to leave the riverbank, Cowman carefully unfolded the paper Thomas had given him. What he saw there made his blood run cold: a geological survey map marking significant mineral deposits beneath the Hartwell property. This wasn't just about railroad expansion. This was about a fortune in silver and copper that Blackwood intended to claim for himself. As they rode back toward Cowman's cabin, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the ridge above or the glint of sunlight reflecting off a spyglass. Word of Thomas Hartwell's death would reach Cornelius Blackwood within the hour, and with it, the news that his carefully laid plans had a witness, a 10-year-old boy who now knew too much. The game had begun, and Cowman found himself playing for stakes higher than he had ever imagined. In protecting Samuel, he wasn't just saving a child's life. He was standing against the most powerful man in the territory, a man who had the sheriff, the mayor, and half the town council in his pocket. As the sun began to set over Cedar Valley, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Cowman realized that his days of solitude were over. Whether he liked it or not, he was about to become the most wanted man in the territory, not by the law, but by something far more dangerous, a man with unlimited resources and no conscience. "Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story." The first chapter of their dangerous journey was just beginning, and neither Cowman nor Samuel could have imagined the web of corruption and deceit they were about to uncover, or the price they would both pay for seeking justice in a town where money talked louder than truth. 3 days had passed since Thomas Hartwell's death, and the official story spreading through Cedar Valley was as predictable as it was false. According to Sheriff Morrison, Thomas had been killed by drifters, probably the same gang that had been robbing travelers along the mountain passes. Case closed, no investigation needed. But Cowman knew better. From his cabin window, he had watched the unusual activity in town through his father's old spyglass. Black carriages coming and going from the Blackwood mansion, riders carrying messages at all hours, and most telling of all, the sheriff's multiple visits to Blackwood's estate. The pieces of a conspiracy were falling into place, but the full picture remained frustratingly unclear. Samuel had barely spoken since that terrible day by the river. The boy sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames with eyes that had seen too much. Cowman found himself in unfamiliar territory. He had lived alone for so long that caring for a traumatized child felt like learning a foreign language. "You need to eat something, son," Cowman said, placing a plate of beans and cornbread beside the boy. Samuel looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Cowman, why did they kill my papa? We didn't have much money. Our land isn't even that good for farming." Cowman sat down across from the boy, pulling out the geological survey map Thomas had given him. "That's where you're wrong, Samuel. Your father discovered something that makes your land very valuable indeed." He spread the map on the rough wooden table, pointing to the markings that indicated mineral deposits. "See these symbols? They show silver and copper veins running right under your property. Your father must have commissioned this survey recently." Samuel studied the map with growing understanding. "So Mr. Blackwood wanted to buy our land cheap, and when Papa wouldn't sell, he decided to take it by force," Cowman finished grimly. "With your father gone and you just a boy, he probably figured he could claim the land through some legal manipulation." A knock at the door made both of them freeze. Cowman motioned for Samuel to hide behind the woodpile as he approached the door, his hand resting on his gun. "Who's there?" "It's Doc Williams, Cowman. I need to speak with you." Cowman recognized the voice of the town's physician, one of the few men in Cedar Valley he still trusted. He opened the door cautiously, finding the elderly doctor looking nervously over his shoulder. "Doc, what brings you out here?" Dr. Williams stepped inside quickly, removing his hat. "I examined Thomas Hartwell's body, Cowman. That bullet wound, it wasn't made by any ordinary gun. The caliber and the precision suggest a military rifle, probably a Sharps. That's not the kind of weapon drifters carry. What else did you find?" The doctor's expression grew grave. Thomas had defensive wounds on his hands, and there were signs he'd been beaten before he was shot. This wasn't a quick robbery gone wrong. Someone wanted information from him. Samuel emerged from his hiding place, his face pale but determined. "Dr. Williams, did you know my papa?" The doctor's expression softened. "I did, son. He was a good man. In fact, he came to see me just last week asking about mineral surveys and land rights. He seemed excited about something, but also worried." "Worried about what?" Cowman asked. "He said he'd made a discovery that could change everything for you and him, Samuel, but he was afraid of what certain people might do if they found out. He asked me to keep some documents safe for him." Dr. Williams reached into his medical bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. "He said if anything happened to him, I should give these to someone I trusted who could protect his son." Cowman took the envelope, noting Thomas Hartwell's careful handwriting on the outside. "For Samuel's future, the truth about Cedar Valley." Inside, they found additional survey reports, correspondence with mining experts, and most damning of all, a letter from Cornelius Blackwood offering to buy the Hartwell property for a fraction of its true value. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before Thomas's death and contained a thinly veiled threat about the unfortunate accidents that sometimes befell stubborn landowners. "This is evidence of premeditated murder," Dr. Williams said quietly. "But Blackwood has Sheriff Morrison in his pocket. Taking this to the law would be like signing your own death warrant." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses made them all tense. Through the window, Cowman saw Sheriff Morrison and 3 deputies riding toward the cabin. "Samuel, get to the root cellar," Cowman whispered urgently. "Doc, you never saw these papers." The boy disappeared through a hidden trapdoor just as Morrison's heavy fist pounded on the door. "Open up, Cowman! Official business!" Cowman opened the door with deliberate calm. "Sheriff, what can I do for you?" Morrison, a heavy-set man with cold eyes and a badge that had been bought rather than earned, pushed past Cowman into the cabin. "We're looking for the Hartwell boy. Word is you might know where he is." "Can't say that I do. Haven't seen hide nor hair of any boy." One of the deputies, a young man named Jake who still had some conscience left, spoke up. His father was killed 3 days ago. The boy's got no other family. Someone needs to look after him. That's real charitable of you, Jake, Cowman replied. But like I said, I haven't seen him. Morrison's eyes swept the cabin, taking in the 2 plates on the table, the small set of clothes drying by the fire. Funny thing, Cowman. You've been living alone for 5 years, but it looks like you've had company recently. Man gets lonely sometimes. Had a friend visit from the next county? What friend would that be? Cowman met Morrison's stare without flinching. The kind who values his privacy? Just like me. Dr. Williams cleared his throat. Sheriff, I should mention that I've been treating Cowman for a recurring fever. He's been having hallucinations, seeing people who aren't there. It's quite common with his condition. Morrison looked between the 2 men suspiciously, but couldn't find any concrete evidence. Well, if you do happen to see the Hartwell boy, you bring him to town immediately. Mr. Blackwood has generously offered to arrange for his care and education. After the sheriff and his men left, Samuel emerged from the root cellar, his face flushed with anger. They want to take me to Mr. Blackwood, the man who killed my papa? Over my dead body, Cowman said firmly. But this changes things. We can't stay here much longer. Morrison will be back with more men, and next time he won't leave without searching every inch of this place. Dr. Williams gathered his things. There's an old mining camp about 20 miles north in the mountains. It's been abandoned for years, but the cabins are still standing. You could hide there while you figure out your next move. What about exposing Blackwood? Samuel asked. We have proof now. Cowman studied the documents again. We have evidence, but we need more than that. We need witnesses, people willing to testify against the most powerful man in the territory. And we need to stay alive long enough to see justice done. As night fell over Cedar Valley, Cowman and Samuel prepared for a journey that would take them deeper into danger than either of them realized. But they also carried with them something that Blackwood couldn't buy or intimidate: the truth and the determination to see it revealed, no matter the cost. The second chapter of their quest for justice was ending, but the most dangerous part of their journey was just beginning. In the mountains ahead lay not just sanctuary, but the key to unraveling a conspiracy that reached far beyond one man's greed, a conspiracy that would shake Cedar Valley to its very foundations. The abandoned mining camp sat like a ghost town against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks, its weathered buildings telling stories of dreams long dead and fortunes lost to time. Cowman and Samuel had been hiding there for a week, living off supplies they'd managed to gather and water from a nearby stream. But isolation, while keeping them safe, was also keeping them from the answers they desperately needed. It was Samuel who first spotted the smoke rising from the valley below, not the thin wisps of cooking fires, but the thick black columns that spoke of destruction. Through Cowman's spyglass, they watched in horror as flames consumed what remained of the Hartwell homestead. "They're burning the evidence," Cowman said grimly. "Blackwood's making sure there's nothing left to connect him to your father's death." Samuel's hands clenched into fists. "We can't just sit here and watch him destroy everything Papa worked for." "We won't," Cowman replied, his mind already forming a plan. "But we need allies, and I think I know where to find them." That evening, as darkness provided cover, they made their way down from the mountains to a place Cowman hadn't visited in years, the old Paiute reservation on the eastern edge of the valley. The tribal elder, Joseph Running Bear, had been Cowman's friend since childhood. one of the few people who knew the full story of why Cowman had become a hermit. The reunion was emotional but brief. Joseph listened intently as Cowman explained their situation, his weathered face growing darker with each detail. "Blackwood's greed knows no bounds," Joseph said finally. "He's been pressuring our people to sell reservation land for his railroad. When we refused, strange accidents started happening, cattle poisoned, water sources contaminated, young men arrested on false charges. So he's been using the same tactics on everyone," Samuel said, his voice filled with righteous anger. Joseph nodded. "But there's something else you should know. 3 nights ago, one of our scouts saw riders heading toward the old Spanish mine in Devil's Canyon, the mine that's been sealed for 50 years. Cowman's blood ran cold. What would Blackwood want with that place? Maybe the same thing your father discovered, young Samuel," Joseph replied. "The Spanish didn't just mine silver there. They found something much more valuable, something they tried to hide before they abandoned the territory." The next morning, armed with this new information, Cowman and Samuel set out for Devil's Canyon. The journey was treacherous, requiring them to navigate narrow mountain paths while avoiding Blackwood's patrols that seemed to be everywhere. When they finally reached the canyon, what they found exceeded their worst fears. The old mine entrance had been reopened, and a full operation was underway. Dozens of workers, many of them clearly forced laborers, were extracting ore under the watchful eyes of armed guards. But this wasn't just any mining operation. The scale and secrecy suggested something far more significant than silver or copper. Hidden among the rocks above the mine, Cowman and Samuel watched as a familiar figure emerged from the mine entrance. Cornelius Blackwood himself, dressed in expensive clothes that looked absurdly out of place in the dusty canyon, was inspecting the operation with obvious satisfaction. "Faster!" Blackwood shouted at the workers. "We need to extract everything before the federal inspectors arrive next month. Once they see what we've found here, they'll want to claim it for the government." One of his foremen approached nervously. "Sir, the men are asking about the Hartwell boy. Sheriff Morrison still hasn't found him." Blackwood's expression turned murderous. "That boy is the only witness to our operation at the river. Find him, or I'll find someone who can." "What about Cowman? He's been seen in the area." "Cowman is a washed-up drunk who's been hiding in the mountains for years. But if he's protecting the boy—" Blackwood paused, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Kill them both. Make it look like an accident." Samuel started to move, but Cowman held him back. They needed to see more, to understand the full scope of Blackwood's operation. What they witnessed next would change everything they thought they knew about the conspiracy. A wagon emerged from the mine, heavily loaded and covered with canvas. When the wind caught the covering, revealing its contents, Cowman's eyes widened in shock. The wagon wasn't carrying silver or copper. It was loaded with gold ore, more than he had ever seen in one place. But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. As they watched, another figure emerged from the mine, Sheriff Morrison, his badge glinting in the sunlight as he supervised the loading of the precious cargo. "The entire law enforcement system is corrupt," Cowman whispered. "Morrison isn't just taking bribes. He's a full partner in this operation." Samuel's voice was tight with emotion. "How many people has he killed to keep this secret?" Their question was answered sooner than they expected. As they prepared to leave their hiding spot, they overheard a conversation that made their blood run cold. "What about the doctor?" Morrison asked Blackwood. Williams has been asking too many questions about the Hartwell autopsy. Dr. Williams has served this community for 40 years. Blackwood replied coldly. It would be tragic if he suffered a sudden heart attack. These things happen to elderly men under stress. And the tribal elder? Joseph Running Bear has been stirring up trouble on the reservation. A hunting accident, perhaps. The mountains can be dangerous for an old man. Cowman realized with growing horror that their investigation had put innocent people in mortal danger. Dr. Williams and Joseph Running Bear were going to be killed simply for helping them, and there was no way to warn them in time. But as they prepared to leave Devil's Canyon, Samuel made a discovery that would change the entire game. Hidden among the rocks near their observation point, he found something that previous watchers had left behind. A leather satchel containing detailed records of Blackwood's operation, including financial documents, shipping manifests, and most importantly, a list of government officials who were being bribed to look the other way. Papa wasn't the first person to discover this, Samuel said, studying the documents. Someone else has been watching Blackwood for months, gathering evidence. The documents were signed with a simple initial, M. But whoever M was, they had been building a case against Blackwood that went far beyond murder. This was evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. As they made their way back toward the mountains, Cowman and Samuel didn't notice the figure following them at a distance, or the fact that their every move was being carefully observed. The mysterious M had been watching them just as carefully as they had been watching Blackwood, and a meeting was about to take place that would reveal the true scope of the conspiracy they were fighting. The third chapter of their dangerous quest was ending, but the most shocking revelations were yet to come. In the shadows of the mountains, allies and enemies were about to reveal themselves, and the final confrontation with Cornelius Blackwood would test everything Cowman and Samuel had learned about courage, justice, and the price of doing what's right. The mysterious figure who had been following them revealed herself just as Cowman and Samuel reached their mountain hideout. She was a woman in her 30s, dressed in practical riding clothes, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to danger. In her hand, she held a federal marshal's badge. "Marshal Margaret Thompson," she introduced herself, "and I've been building a case against Cornelius Blackwood for the better part of a year." Cowman's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but the marshal raised her hands peacefully. "I'm not here to arrest you, Cowman. I'm here because we need each other." "You're M," Samuel said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You left those documents for someone to find." Marshal Thompson nodded. "I've been working undercover, but I needed local witnesses and evidence. When Thomas Hartwell was murdered, I knew Blackwood had escalated beyond simple intimidation. Your father, Samuel, had contacted the federal government about his mineral survey. That's what got him killed." She spread out a map on the rough wooden table, marking locations throughout the territory. "Blackwood's operation is bigger than you can imagine. He's not just stealing land in Cedar Valley. He's been systematically murdering landowners across 3 territories, always making it look like accidents or random crimes." "How many people?" Cowman asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "At least 30 families over the past 2 years. The gold mine in Devil's Canyon is just one of several illegal operations he's running. But here's what he doesn't know. The federal government has been investigating territorial corruption for months. We're ready to move, but we need witnesses who can testify to what they've seen." Samuel stepped forward, his young face set with determination. "I'll testify. I saw those men right away after they shot my papa." "It's not that simple, son," the marshal replied gently. "Blackwood has judges, sheriffs, and politicians in his pocket. We need to expose the entire network at once, or the survivors will just disappear the witnesses." Cowman studied the map, recognizing a pattern in the marked locations. "All these properties sit on the proposed railroad route, but that's not the real prize, is it?" Marshal Thompson smiled grimly. "You're smarter than Blackwood gives you credit for. The railroad is just a cover. These lands sit on the largest undiscovered gold deposits in the Western Territories. Blackwood has been using geological surveys to identify the richest areas, then systematically eliminating the landowners." "So what's the plan?" Samuel asked. "Tomorrow night, Blackwood is hosting a celebration at his mansion, supposedly to commemorate the start of railroad construction. But it's really a meeting of his entire criminal network. Every corrupt official, every hired gun, every crooked businessman will be there. And you want us to walk into the lion's den," Cowman said. "I want you to help me spring a trap that will catch all the lions at once." The plan was audacious and dangerous. Marshal Thompson had arranged for federal troops to surround Cedar Valley, but they needed someone inside Blackwood's mansion to signal when all the conspirators were present. More importantly, they needed the evidence that Blackwood kept in his private safe, evidence that would implicate government officials all the way to the territorial capital. "I can get inside," Cowman said. "I know the mansion's layout from when I worked there years ago." "Worked there?" Samuel asked, surprised. Cowman's expression grew distant. "Before I became a hermit, I was Blackwood's head of security. I quit when I discovered he was using intimidation tactics against small ranchers. That's why I've been hiding in the mountains. I knew too much, and he's been waiting for a chance to eliminate me." This revelation changed everything. Cowman's knowledge of Blackwood's operation and the mansion's security would be invaluable, but it also meant that Blackwood would recognize him immediately. "There's something else," Marshal Thompson said. "Dr. Williams and Joseph Running Bear are both safe. We've had them under federal protection since yesterday. But Blackwood doesn't know that. He thinks his plan to eliminate them is still proceeding." The next evening, as the sun set over Cedar Valley, the final confrontation began. Cowman, disguised as one of Blackwood's hired guns, made his way into the mansion during the celebration. Samuel and Marshal Thompson waited in the hills above town, ready to signal the federal troops when the time was right. Inside the mansion, Cowman was shocked by what he found. The celebration was indeed a meeting of conspirators, but the scope of the corruption was staggering. Territorial judges, federal land commissioners, army officers, and businessmen from across the region were all present, all part of Blackwood's network. But the most shocking revelation came when Cowman overheard a conversation between Blackwood and a man he recognized as the territorial governor himself. "The Hartwell boy is still missing," the governor said nervously. "If he talks, he won't live long enough to talk," Blackwood replied coldly. "Neither will that fool Cowman. Morrison has men surrounding his cabin as we speak." Cowman realized with growing horror that their mountain hideout had been discovered. Samuel and Marshal Thompson were walking into a trap. He had to warn them, but first, he needed to get the evidence from Blackwood's safe. Using his knowledge of the mansion's layout, Cowman made his way to Blackwood's private office. The safe was exactly where he remembered it, and fortunately, Blackwood's arrogance had led him to keep the same combination after all these years. Inside the safe, Cowman found documents that exceeded even Marshal Thompson's expectations. Not only were there records of the murders and land thefts, but also evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial and federal government. Blackwood had been planning to use his stolen wealth to buy political influence all the way to Washington, but as Cowman prepared to leave with the evidence, he found his path blocked by Sheriff Morrison and two deputies. "Well, well," Morrison sneered. "The hermit comes out of hiding. Mr. Blackwood will be very pleased to see you." The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Cowman's years of solitude hadn't dulled his fighting skills, and Morrison's men were more accustomed to intimidating farmers than facing a determined gunfighter. When the smoke cleared, Morrison lay dead, and his deputies had fled. But the gunfire had alerted the entire mansion. As Cowman fought his way through Blackwood's hired guns, he managed to signal Marshal Thompson with a prearranged light in the window. Federal troops immediately surrounded the mansion, trapping all the conspirators inside. The final confrontation between Cowman and Blackwood took place in the mansion's grand ballroom in front of all the assembled criminals. Blackwood, his carefully constructed facade finally cracking, drew his gun with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. "You destroyed everything I built," Blackwood screamed. 30 years of planning, ruined by a washed-up gunfighter and a sniveling boy." "You destroyed yourself," Cowman replied calmly. "The moment you decided that." Money was worth more than human life. The gunfight was brief, but decisive. Blackwood, for all his wealth and power, was no match for a man fighting for justice rather than greed. When it was over, the most powerful man in Cedar Valley lay dead, and his criminal empire was in ruins. In the weeks that followed, the trials of Blackwood's conspirators became the biggest news story in the Western Territories. Samuel's testimony, combined with the evidence from Blackwood's safe, led to convictions that reached all the way to the territorial capital. Corrupt officials were removed from office, stolen lands were returned to their rightful owners, and the federal government implemented new oversight procedures to prevent such widespread corruption in the future. But perhaps the most important change was in the relationship between Cowman and Samuel. The boy who had lost his father found a new family, and the man who had hidden from the world for 5 years discovered that he still had something to offer society. Cowman legally adopted Samuel and used his reward money from the federal government to start a ranch that would provide homes for other orphaned children. Dr. Williams and Joseph Running Bear both played crucial roles in the community's healing process. The doctor helped establish a new medical clinic, while the tribal elder worked to build bridges between the various communities in the valley. As for Cedar Valley itself, the town that had been paralyzed by fear and corruption found its voice again. The citizens who had been too afraid to speak out against Blackwood's tyranny came together to build a community based on justice and mutual support rather than fear and greed. On a warm spring morning, exactly 1 year after Thomas Hartwell's death, Cowman and Samuel stood by the river where their journey had begun. A new headstone marked Thomas's grave, and wildflowers planted by the townspeople created a peaceful memorial. "Do you think Papa would be proud of what we did?" Samuel asked. Cowman placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "I think your father would be proud of the man you're becoming, Samuel, and I think he'd be happy to know that his death wasn't in vain, that it led to justice for a lot of people." As they walked back toward their ranch, where other children were waiting for them, Cowman reflected on how much his life had changed. The lonely hermit who had wanted nothing more than to be left alone had become the patriarch of a growing family and a respected leader in his community. The story that had begun with a child's cry of despair had ended with hope, justice, and the promise of a better future. In Cedar Valley, the age of corruption and fear was over, and a new chapter of community and courage had begun. Sometimes, Cowman thought, the most important battles aren't fought for glory or gold, but for the simple right of good people to live without fear. And sometimes, the most unlikely heroes are found not in the halls of power, but in the hearts of those who refuse to turn away when they hear a child crying for help. The sun set over Cedar Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, as if the heavens themselves were celebrating the triumph of justice over greed and love over loneliness. In the distance, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the valley, a promise that the future would be brighter than the past. And in that moment, both Cowman and Samuel knew that they had found something more valuable than all of Blackwood's stolen gold. They had found home, family, and the unshakable knowledge that doing what's right, no matter the cost, is always worth the fight. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new, amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.